Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Kitab al-Shi'r, the book of poetry. This section of hadith does not have a chapter name assigned to it, but in any case, the first hadith from Amr ibn Sharid from his father says, one day I was riding behind the Prophet, and the Prophet asked him, "Do you know any poetry from Umayyah ibn Abi Salt?" And I said, "Yes." The Prophet said, "Go on, recite it." And he says, I recited a line, and the Prophet said, "Go on, recite more." And I recited a line, and the Prophet said, "Go on, recite more." And so on it went like this until I recited to him 100 lines. We take from this narration that reciting poetry and listening to it is permissible. We also take how infatuated the Arab were with poetry, such that this Sahabi, just riding behind the Prophet, managed to recite 100 lines of poetry. Now which person could just offhand recite 100 lines of poetry? Now this poetry of Umayyah ibn Abi Salt must have been good quality poetry because the Prophet wanted to hear it. It's mentioned that he almost became a Muslim. Now that means to say he almost became a Muslim in his poetry. So his poetry must have been something which agreed with the Aqidah of Islam, even if the poet himself was not a Muslim. Also in the chapter from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, أصدق كلمة قالها شاعر كلمة لبيد ألا كل شيء ما خلا الله باطل. Behold, everything apart from Allah is in vain. This line of poetry is similar to where Allah Jalla wa Ala says, كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه. Everything is destroyed except his face. As for Labid, his name is Labid ibn Rabi'ah, and he was a famous poet, and he embraced Islam and gave up on the poetry after he heard the Quran, except perhaps a little poetry here and there. But these words in this narration agree with Tawheed. Also from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says that the Prophet passed by the village of Arj, and there was a poet reciting poetry. Thereupon the Prophet said, خُذُوا الشَّيْطَانَ أَوْ أَمْسِكُوا الشَّيْطَانَ لَأَنْ يَمْتَلِئَ جَوْفُ رَجُلٍ قَيْحًا خَيْرٌ لَهُ مِنْ أَنْ يَمْتَلِئَ شِعْرًا. Catch or seize the shaitan, that the belly of a man should be filled with pus is better than it to be filled with poetry. Note here that the Prophet calls this man shaitan, because you can have shayateen from the ins as well as the jinn. Normally shaitan are the rebellious types, from the jinn or from the humans, even from the animals. This hadith appears to contradict with the one that has just come before, where the Prophet is listening to the poetry. In fact, he listened to 100 lines of poetry of Umayyah ibn Abi Salt. And now here he's saying that the belly of a man to be filled with pus is better for him than to be filled with poetry. So the way to reconcile is to say that a man is completely engrossed in poetry, and it would therefore take him away from the recitation of the Quran and also learning his deen. Why did the Prophet call him a shaitan? We do not know, but there must have been some reason. In any case, we say if you are completely engrossed with poetry, then it is as the Prophet says, it is better your belly be filled with pus than poetry. So how about nowadays with conventional music, which is even more engrossing than poetry? Because at least with poetry you do not have musical instruments. So the music nowadays is yet worse. And yet you find people deeming it to be permissible and listening to it as if it is halal. Otherwise, the basic principle of poetry is that it is permissible to be recited and listened to. This next chapter about dice, from Buraidah, that the Prophet said, مَنْ لَعِبَ بِالنَّرْدِ شِير فَكَأَنَّمَا صَبَغَ يَدَهُ فِي لَحْمِ خِنْزِيرٍ وَدَمِهِ. Whoever plays with the dice, then it is as if he has dyed his hands in the meat of a pig and its blood. We find from this narration that playing any games with dice is haram, and the likeness is that you are eating a pig, because when you eat a pig meat, then your hands will become stained with the blood of the pig. So he's likening playing dice games with eating the meat of the pig. The reason for his prohibition is that dice games will distract you much from doing that which is beneficial from the recitation of the Quran and the dhikr of Allah Jalla wa Ala. What we are talking about here is playing dice games. As for using dice for educational purposes, or for some other means, useful means, so that is to say not in playing games and distracting yourselves thereby, then that is another matter, and the asl is that it is permissible. Okay, what about chess? Because there is a dispute about this as well. There is nothing from the Prophet to suggest that chess is haram, despite the fact that chess would have been in existence during the time of the Prophet. We say about chess that the balanced view to take would be, if this involves gambling, people are putting money in the pot, for example, then it is haram on account of the fact that it is gambling. Likewise, if it distracts you from your obligatory duties, then that will be haram as well, and the same can be said with any activity for that matter, not just chess. As for if these prohibitions are not present, then one cannot say that it is haram due to the fact that there is no evidence from the Prophet. So if somebody is just playing chess recreationally for a limited time, then there appears to be nothing wrong with that. Okay, at this stage, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. We seem to have apparently contradictory evidence with regards to poetry and whether you're allowed to listen to it and write it and recite it. So what's the resolution to this apparent contradiction? Question number 2. In one of the hadith which has passed us by, we could take evidence that it is permissible to take knowledge from kuffar. What evidence would prove this? Question number 3. What is the balanced ruling on playing chess?